So on my workbench today, I have a Technics SL-QD33 turntable. So I worked on a similar P-mount turntable recently, but unlike that one, this has an intact lid, although the hinges are not particularly strong. The D in the name indicates that it is direct drive, which is nice, and the Q indicates that that speed is quartz locked, which is a really nice feature. So this does have an intact lid and hinges, and those hinge tabs are not broken. But here's a top tip. So as these get older and more brittle, I've heard that if you transport the turntable with the lid on, the vibration can actually snap them off. So before I put it in the car, I took the lid off and transported it separately. So the seller stated that it did work, but that the start-stop button did not. So let's see how that works. That is apparently true. But if I move the turn, that doesn't feel too good either. And these controls here are actually electronic. So I assumed falsely that the start-stop button would be connected to probably a rod that would actuate something mechanically, but this appears to be electronic, as is the queuing. So that could actually be a problem. So the platter mat is also proprietary. It has some cutouts in it to sense the size of the record. Yeah, moving this tone arm does not feel good at all, so I'm not going to force anything. I'm going to flip it over and take it apart. So there's one red screw here, and it looks like you unscrew these screws under the feet, and there are no feet. So getting these out is not as easy as I thought it would be. So it's not really a standard Phillips screw. So what seems to work best is this large size JIS screwdriver. And what's left of the feet is just a gooey mess. Okay, so this is interesting and not like anything I've worked on before. So this turntable has two motors. Has one to drive the platter, has a separate electric motor to drive the tone arm, with none of those mechanical bits in between. So this turntable is controlled by a microprocessor, and according to the service manual, there is a Control-Alt-Delete type sequence to enter an adjustment or diagnostic mode. So I tried this, and unfortunately nothing happened. So I was pretty disappointed by that. So I decided to Google my problem and found this exchange between two users on Vinyl Engine, which seemed to be describing the exact problem that I had and suggesting it could be fixed by just replacing two capacitors on the main board. Could it be that simple? So I assume that this is the main board to which he was referring, so it easily unscrews. Also screws to the buttons, which are loose. So there are two 47 microfarad capacitors on this board. So these are 6.3 volt capacitors. So they of course have to be replaced with the same capacitance value, but the voltage can be higher. So I have some 47 microfarad 10 volt capacitors that should work. So I replaced those two capacitors, and okay, so the light is blinking, but it's actually making some noise, and the tone arm actually moved. The queuing is working. Speed selection is working. And the platter is turning. So was that all it took? Well, maybe not. Well, actually, because the record player thinks it's smarter than me, it needs to have a record on it to cover up these two sensors before it will start. So the tone arm was so stiff because, of course, it wasn't moving through mechanical resistance, some gummed up gears. It was moving through resistance of the electric motor. So it feels a lot better now. So the queuing seems to work. And it even stops automatically. That tone arm motor is making a little bit of noise, but that's a good result. So pulling off the P-mount cartridge, that is pretty grungy. So I'm going to put a known good cartridge on to test if it makes any sound. So because this is quite a good turntable, I decided to fit the best P-mount cartridge I had, this Realistic RX 1500, which is actually an Audio-Technica AT100 series with a brand new genuine Audio-Technica elliptical stylus. So having just changed those two capacitors on the main board, the turntable is now running really well. But considering that all the capacitors are the same age, even though it seems to be working fine, I think it would be prudent to change out these electrolytic capacitors as well. So I didn't actually film replacing the capacitors here because I assumed it wouldn't work and that would be the end of the video. But I will show how to do one of these. So I'm going to remove this cable here. Take out this screw, which also holds a ground. Take out this screw. I'm just going to take out this one over here. And this plastic piece will come off, freeing me up to lift the motor up. So I'm going to do them one at a time so I don't mess anything up. And capacitors have a polarity, so you want to make sure that you have the stripe on the capacitor headed the same direction as it was originally. So I'm going to start with C202, which is a 0.22 microfarad 50 volt capacitor. And I have a replacement right here. So here are the pads for C202. So I'm going to heat it up and use the solder sucker to remove the solder. The pins are bent over a little bit, so I'm going to try to bend them up. And pull on it a little bit from the other side, and there we go. I'm going to insert the new capacitor the correct way and solder it up. I'm going to trim the leads, so that's 1 down, 7 to go. So that went very well, except that 2 of the capacitors, C105 and C106, are what are called bipolar capacitors. So I don't have any of those, but I think at this point, the correct thing to do would be to put it back together and see if it works. And the turntable does still work. I wish I could say I'm not surprised. So I have to put these screws back in to resecure the base, and strangely they're not really even centered in the holes, but the feet would have gone over and around these, and that's just not going to work. So once again, I'm going to use my favorite solution, stick-on sorbothane domes. These ones from Hudson Hi-Fi. These are 20 durometer, so pretty soft for this lightweight turntable. So this is interesting. If I screw this screw back in, it will not hold tight because I guess the rubber part of the foot went underneath here and filled up that gap. So what I had to do is put a washer around it, and that will take care of the problem. And now to take a look at these weak hinges. So there are replacement used ones available on eBay, but who's to say that the replacement would be any better than the one that I have? So the hinge is in the open position right now, and then this is the closed position. So when it's closed, the spring that's inside here is compressed. So I was wondering if maybe from a decade or more of the lid being closed with this not working, if the spring had just kind of gotten squished down over time and just needed a little bit of help. So I left the hinges open on this with no lid on it for several days to see if maybe the spring would regain some of its springiness. So that does seem to have helped. It's not perfect, but it will now stay open pretty much on its own. I did also give it a nice polish and it looks a lot better. So when this turntable was made in 1992, it was actually Technics' next to the top of the line model, behind only the venerable SL-1200 Mark II. So I think that says more about how weak the turntable market was in 1992 than it does about the greatness of this particular turntable, but I think it's pretty nice for what it is. So this turned out to be a pretty easy fix, just replacing those two capacitors on the main board. And once again, I am grateful for the wisdom of others in guiding me in the right direction. So this is actually a pretty neat turntable. It sounds great, actually has better specs than the SL-1200 in some ways, although there's really no comparison between them, and I think would serve most listeners very well. The motor-operated tone arm was not a unique feature. There were other turntables like it. It's actually kind of like Technics' linear tracking turntables in that regard, but it seems to work well, and I'm pleased with how this has turned out. So once again, thanks for listening.